Alrighty then, we're back again with Chapter 7 of our Mission Handbook. Chapter 7 has to do with our mission finances. I suppose that of all the chapters in the handbook, this one in particular may have precipitated questions for you, doubts for you. I mean, how can a mission operate on this basis? How can they operate without soliciting funds? How can they operate without going into debt? If you've heard anything about the World Mission Prayer League, you might have heard about these kinds of things. And you might wonder, how in the world does that work? We're going to be looking at our mission handbook once again, sort of the overall framework for our financial policies. It would be wrong to look at non-solicitation as a kind of legalism. It would be wrong to look at our principle of non-indebtedness as a kind of make or break, third rail legalism. And if you touch it, you die. That's not exactly right. There are foundational principles behind these things. Non-solicitation and non-indebtedness are the way that we express our foundational principles at present. And we're always learning how to express them better and more authentically. So let's have a look at the kind of biographical background to these things. I mean, like, it's not as if these things have just kind of fallen out of the sky. They have a history and they have a background. And in particular, we're going to find that the financial principles of the World Mission Prayer League have a background with these two guys, Paul and Jonathan Lindell, in the early part of the 20th century. You've met these guys. We talked about them previously. Paul and Jonathan Lindell gave shape to the World Mission Prayer League like really no one else. They, in turn, took their inspiration from people that they came to know and traditions that they came to know as children, as missionary kids in China. And in particular, this guy, Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor, who lived from 1832 to 1905 and provided the kind of backdrop for really all of Christian missions in China in those days. Here's a picture of Hudson Taylor's famous Lammermuir party in 1866. There were no pastors there. There were a lot of single women there. There were children among the party. It was kind of an atypical sort of a missionary family. And it represented really kind of a turning point in the history of Christian missions in China. And, well, a turning point in the history of Christian missions in general. Hudson Taylor became the founding father, you might say, of something that we've come to call the faith mission movement. Let me share with you a couple of quotations from Hudson Taylor. These are the kinds of things that rippled in the heart of Paul and Jonathan Lindell. And you can find them kind of rippling in the heart of the World Mission Prayer League until this very day. Many Christians estimate difficulties in the light of their own resources and thus attempt little and often fail in the little they attempt. All God's giants have been weak men and women who did great things for God because they reckoned on His power and presence with them. I mean, like, this is kind of a core idea for the World Mission Prayer League. It has to do with counting on the faithfulness of God. Okay, you don't bring much to the task. I'll agree with you, and neither do I. All of God's giants have been people just like you who haven't brought much to it, who don't really have so much to offer when you stop to think about it, but who have counted on God's faithfulness to them and counted on God's grace and mercy in their own lives. And they've discovered that God's grace makes them something that they cannot be on their own. This is a foundational principle, and it ripples into our financial principles to this very day. So here's another one. God's work done in God's way will never lack for God's supply. So if you've ever heard of Hudson Taylor before, and if you've ever learned a Hudson Taylor quote before, this is one that you might call to mind. God's work done in God's way will never lack for God's supply. If we believe that God has called us to a task, we can count on Him to see us through. Here's another one. Believing prayer will lead to wholehearted action. Hudson Taylor said that, if you believe that prayer is more or less what we say it to be, if you believe that prayer is at least as real as going down to the corner grocery store and asking the attendant where the ketchup might be, if you believe that it's at least that real, so that when you pray, you're doing business with God Most High, with the Sovereign of nations, with the King of kings and Lord of lords, well, then you might undertake wholehearted action that you didn't think possible before. So there was Hudson Taylor, and then there was also this guy, C.T. Studd. He lived from 1860 to 1931 and became the founder of something called the World Evangelization Crusade. As a matter of fact, in the early years of our organization, we called ourselves the Lutheran World Crusade, precisely because we took that inspiration from old C.T. Studd. Well, C.T. Studd said stuff like this. He said, Christ wants not nibblers of the possible, but grabbers of the impossible. So maybe you're going to read the Handbook of the World Mission Prayer League. Maybe you're going to come upon Chapter 7 and our financial policies. And maybe you're going to think to yourself, oh gosh, that sounds impossible to me. And I suppose in one way, you'd be right. We've organized ourselves in a way that doesn't seem really so rational, so very logical. We take our inspiration from people like C.T. Studd, who said, God wants us to live like that. He wants us to live in the impossible. He wants us to reach out to things that we didn't think were really quite within our grasp. So this is something that you also find rippling into the World Mission Prayer League. So now let's take a look at the pages of the handbook. We're going to want to lift out a few sections in the handbook in Chapter 7. So there you go. There's paragraph 126. You'll see it right there. The mission's finances are received, acknowledged, managed, and dispersed in a manner consistent with our spiritual values and commitments. Think C.T. Studd and think Hudson Taylor. We might call it the Prayer League way. Okay, the Prayer League way. If you stop by our office on Clifton Avenue, you're going to find people talking this way. They're going to say, well, that's just the Prayer League way, they're going to say. Or maybe sometimes they're going to say, well, that's not the Prayer League way.
That's not the Prayer League way.
It's not as if you can define the Prayer League way with great detail or precision, okay? It's not as if you can just kind of reduce it to a whole bunch of do's and don'ts. It doesn't really work that way. The Prayer League way is rather a kind of spirit. It's a kind of overall spirituality. It's a kind of value system and mindset, a kind of worldview that's infused with the sorts of stuff that we see in C.T. Studd and Hudson Taylor and so many others, that reads a little bit like it's got some New Testament values in it, I think. And then it issues eventually in practical ways of doing things. Before the handbook talks about the ways that we manage our credits and debits, before it talks about the ways that we do our bookkeeping and accounting kinds of things, the handbook talks about kind of a mindset. So here's the first thing that makes up the Prayer League way. Prayer. Paragraph 127 says, it's the Prayer League way to pray. Do we feel the need for financial support? Okay, you might sometime. We're going to ask you to pray. Do we anticipate the need for goods and equipment or travel or training, project support, or other material supplies? All right, that might happen. We're going to ask you to pray again. We believe ourselves called to pray for the needs of the mission and its workers, and to trust in God to provide as He designs. Our first resource is not going to be turning to some agency that will help us raise funds better. It's not going to be like turning to some more clever way to communicate our financial needs. That's not going to be our first thought. Our first thought is going to be to pray. What do we do with the needs that we experience along the way? I mean, like, what do we do with that? We're going to encourage you to pray about those needs. God won't be surprised. And if God has called you to the things that you believe He's called you to, He's going to provide as well for undertaking them in His service. Here's another principle. We believe in the principle of dependence. Paragraph 128. It's the Prayer League way to depend upon the provision of God with trusting intentionality. Trusting intentionality. That means doing it on purpose. We believe with Hudson Taylor that God's person doing God's work in God's place and timing will never lack for God's supply. This is a fundamental faith conviction. God is faithful. We may depend upon Him to provide in every way for His work around the world. And this is the way it works out. Simply put, we believe that the promises of God are sufficient grounds for obeying His call to service. We have trusted Him to provide everything necessary for our salvation. We may trust Him to provide everything necessary for our obedient service as well. You know, it strikes me as so weird that the Christians can trust God to forgive their sins. And I tell you what, I know Christians who are really bang up sinners, that's for sure. They will trust God to resolve their sins. They will trust God to make them holy. They will trust God to give them a way into heaven. But they have a hard time trusting Him with a meal in the afternoon. If you can trust God with the big stuff, then you can trust God with the small stuff too. We believe in the principle of dependence. And the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we write our newsletters, the way that we communicate our needs, the way that we visit with churches, the way that we live our lives, we want to demonstrate that God is in control, God is dependable, and we need none other than God and His mercies to sustain us in our life and ministry. Here's another principle. We believe in the principle of immediacy, paragraph 140. It is the Prayer League way to depend upon God to meet our needs day by day, month by month, year by year. 141. We believe that God will provide all that we need for all that He has called us to do. This means as well that we tend to disperse what resources we receive as we receive them. We receive them as the provision of God, and we're eager to put them to work. In the early days of the mission, we at the end of every month, we dispersed everything that we had and zeroed out our books. If we had an extra $100 at the end of the month, we found a way to give it away. Because of this principle, the principle of immediacy. In the years since, well, we have found ways to keep a balance from month to month, happily. But this principle remains true. If God blesses us with $1 million, we're going to look for a way to invest that $1 million in His cause around the world. We haven't made it a custom of setting up like endowment funds or stuff like that. We don't like saving for a rainy day. It just doesn't really kind of fit us so very much. Rather, we believe if God blesses us with something, He wants us to use that something for His cause. And we want to do that day by day and month by month and year by year. So here's another principle. We call it the principle of simplicity. Paragraph 143, it's the Prayer League way to approach life and ministry in a lean, low overhead, simple manner. We believe ourselves called to live and serve on a modest and sacrificial scale rather than an abounding one. We have received our resources as gifts from God. It is our responsibility to employ our resources as carefully and effectively as possible. We want our missionaries to live more or less as closely as they can on the scale of the people that they serve around the world. And we're going to help them that way by paying them very little. So, we want to live a simple life as much as possible. It's not because we believe that simplicity is something like more holy. Give me a break. That's not more holy. It's not because we think that it's better to have one pair of socks with holes in the heels, and somehow that makes you a better Christian than having some nice wool socks. Let me put it this way. If people are going to trip over our message or our life, we want them to trip over the tripping stone. We want them to trip over Jesus and not over, the clothes that we have hanging in our closet, or the kinds of food that we put on our table, or the kinds of vehicles that we drive. We want them to trip over Jesus and not over anything else. This is what we mean by simplicity. Here's another principle. We call it the principle of sharing, paragraph 145. Sharing is part of the Prayer League way. We understand ourselves called as a community to bear one another's burdens in faithful prayer before the throne of grace. We aim to share with one another prayer concerns, spiritual and emotional support, material resources, and in other practical ways. Every month, our business office has a way of sharing with all of us, those of us who haven't received full support. And it just kind of takes my breath away. Almost every month when you hear that sort of thing, people will share. They'll share sacrificially with one another just to kind of bear the burden together. Sharing is part of the Prayer League way as well. We believe in the principle of designated giving. Designated giving is part of the Prayer League way. Our praying friends and financial donors may indicate their preferred designations as they make their contributions. We believe that God Himself has motivated their giving. We aim to honor every designation as from the hand of God Himself. Okay, well, now, if you work for the IRS, that's the kind of passage that maybe will make you raise your eyebrows. We want you to know, if you work for the IRS, that the Executive Committee and the General Director and the Home Council of the World Mission Prayer League retain the authority to use those donations any way that they think they should. At the same time, we believe that designations that come into our office, we believe that they have come, in fact, from God. We believe that God Himself motivates our giving family all across the United States and Canada and beyond, and motivates them to give in certain ways. So when that gift comes into our office with a particular designation on it, we take it very seriously. So finally, here's another principle. We believe in the principle of constant advance. There you see it, paragraph 148. What happens when we operate in this way? Good question. All right. We believe in non-solicitation. We believe in non-indebtedness. We believe in dependence and prayer and so on. So what happens when you operate in that way? This paragraph tells you. We may experience a shortage of funds, a scarcity of material supplies. With few possessions and no reserves, we may encounter opportunities for genuine sacrifice to make do with little for the greater good of shared lives and effective ministries. Yet when obedient faith acts on the promises of God, we may also expect constant advance from within the bounds of God's will for worldwide missions. It is the Prayer League's way to move forward into new advances without hesitation as the Lord guides and reveals His will, trusting Him to open doors, to supply what is needful for the work, and to give fruit and success to our labors according to His own dependable promises. You may be surprised to learn that the World Mission Prayer League, in all of its long history, has never written a financial budget. The reason is because we haven't wanted to look first to a budget, first to material supply, in order to learn if we can do something or not. We've wanted to look to the direction of God, and then we have wanted to depend upon Him to supply for our needs as we undertake it. So this means that we believe ourselves able to advance, even when advance seems impossible. This means that we feel able to obey somehow, even when obedience seems like financially not recommended. We believe in the principle of constant advance. And it's because of that stuff that goes back to Hudson Taylor and C.T. Studd, and before them, the New Testament itself. One thing I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. This morning too. Great is thy faithfulness. So if we serve a God like that, we may follow Him anywhere. And if we serve a God like that, as faithful as that, we may do what He calls us to do. We may obey when He calls us to obey. And we don't need to get all white-knuckled about whether we have the finances to do it.